Hey Life Church, Pastor Stephen here with Allandis, and today we're going to have a discussion on everything that's going on in America today and around the world. We're going to be talking about oppression and inequality and what is it like to be a black man living in America and being part of the evangelical church. We'll put this up on Facebook and YouTube, and you guys can all watch it there. All right, Allandis, obviously you know everything that's going on and so forth. So before we just jump right into this, tell us just a little bit about your history and who you are, your family, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm originally from Dover, Delaware, small town, small state. I worked in the poultry industry for about 16 years. So that led me from Delaware to Georgia, Maryland, North Carolina, and then I ended up here in Iowa, where I met my wife. And even though the plant shut down, I decided to stay here and root myself in Iowa, which is a great place for me. I have a beautiful wife, beautiful family, and I'm just very blessed to be where I am right now in life. Raised by a single mother, which a lot of people in the African American community deal with. Mom and dad split a little after the marriage, couldn't agree on how to co-parent, so I was raised by my mother. She was a very strong woman, still is to this day, instilled all of my morals and values. Everything that I am is because of God, her, and my wife is teaching me a lot these days too.
That's cool. All right, so let's just kind of jump right into this. When you saw we'll just call it what is the murder, what went through your head and what kind of were the emotions that were going on?
Anger was the first emotion. I just kind of had this feeling like, here we go again. You see it. The people stand up and protest, sometimes more than others. The media makes a big deal out of it, and all of a sudden the attention goes away, and then it feels like 6 months or a year later you see the same thing. So definitely anger, and just a feeling like, oh no, here we go again.
Yeah.
It's just the way I felt about it.
Yeah. So I spoke to a friend of mine from the school that I'm going to, working on my master's, Jordy Nunes. Dude's got incredible dreadlocks that I'm jealous of. But he had written a post about his experience living in the Midwest. He has lived up in North Dakota for quite some time. And he is a missionary, and this last year he had gone to 50 different churches to speak, and just wrote about, kind of this underlying racism that seems to always be there, but nobody really wants to talk about or even fess up to.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what has been your experience, not just in the Midwest, but just in general, in life?
Yeah, America is so diverse, depending on where you are. Delaware, my wife says all the time, it's amazing how, there's so many black people and so many white people. And then it's like almost 40% black, 40% white, 10% Hispanic, and then 10% a few other minorities. But growing up in Delaware, I never really experienced racism. We were always divided by class. Like I grew up my mother worked really hard, but we grew up poor.
Yeah.
And I remember, being a child looking across the street at the big Victorian houses with the nice yards and saying, I'm going to have that when I grew up. But I never really experienced races. I just knew that there were poor and then there were people who had money. when I moved to the South, to Georgia, it was the first time I had ever really experienced racism firsthand. There was a gentleman pulled over on the side of the road, white guy. I tried to pull over and help him. He was a little older, and it was hot, and I figured he was struggling. But when I approached him, his words were, look, and he called me the N-word, but if I needed your help, I would have asked you.
Wow.
And it cut me, and I was like, I felt that anger, but I also felt like, wow, it was the first time I've ever dealt with that one-to-one. So it was a little more racism than I was used to in the South. As far as the Midwest, personally, I feel like people here are some of the kindest people that I've ever, met in my life. I've never felt like someone was racist towards me here. I feel like some people don't understand me because of my skin color, or because of just who I am or who I appear to be on social media, which I'm really nobody. I'm just a normal guy. But for the most part, there's a lot of love in the Midwest. One of the things that drew me to this church, besides your transparency and your character as a leader, was the love that I felt when we come to this church.
Yeah.
I was a little worried at first because I was like, there's no black people here, and are people going to accept me? And a lot of the members were a lot older. But after about 3 or 4 times, people started getting used to seeing our faces. They just accepted us. We're a mixed couple. I'm a black man. The older ladies, they kiss me on the cheek. The men all grip my hand, and you just feel the love.
Right.
So I think that from my perspective, I know there are some people who still don't understand me as a black person, but for the most part, I feel like there's a lot of love in the Midwest, and that the people who live here should be proud of who they are.
Yeah, no, that's good. So do you feel like, obviously, everywhere you go in the world, racism is going to exist in some form or fashion. Like, for instance, in China, the Chinese right now are considered some of the most racist people in the world, and it's basically because they've always grouped together, and when outsiders come in, people normally get scared. That's just kind of a natural reaction. So we're always going to find racism somewhere. What's your diagnosis on the Midwest? Because I hear from what you're saying is in the South you really experienced racism. In Delaware, it was more of a class situation. And in the Midwest, you use the term like they don't understand you. So are you saying that you're not really experiencing maybe a generalized racism, but maybe more of just people not understanding who you are as a person?
In the Midwest?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it could be racism in some of my encounters in the Midwest, but I don't want to see it that way.
Sure.
And I say that because people I talk to, they approach me and I feel that they're genuine, but the conversation's always a little awkward, or they may come off timid, and I feel like they just don't understand me.
Yeah.
A lot of people who, here's a good conversation. My next door neighbor, great guy, his name's Corey Munch, comes up to me last week, and he says, I've been kind of walking around on eggshells, but I just have to tell you that I'm sorry. And I was like, sorry for what? You've never done anything to me. And he was like, well, about everything that's going on in the world. He was like, you guys just shouldn't have to deal with that. And I was like, wow, it just struck me. And I was like, man, you don't owe me an apology, but I appreciate those words. And we, share stories. Basically, he told me that, growing up in the small town that he was from, there were no black people.
Right.
So I can understand why sometimes our conversations are limited, because, he really hasn't been around a lot of black people. And sometimes we only know what we see on TV.
True.
And sometimes the black image isn't isn't portrayed in its best light by the media. And sometimes it is, but sometimes I think we hold on to that negative a little more than the positive, or sometimes the negative stories outweigh the positive stories. But the one thing that I really took away from our entire conversation, besides his sincere apology about things that were going on in the world right now, was, he told me that his parents raised him to respect people. Not black people, not white people, just people.
Yeah.
And he said, that's the way I live my life. He was like, I don't see the color of skin. I just see you as a person, a good person.
Right.
And I think that's something that we could all learn from. If we could all just teach our own families or our own friends just how to respect people and not get caught up on color or the way certain people are portrayed on TV or social media, I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So last Wednesday, I had an interesting encounter. I was on my way to do a Bible study with 3 guys in the church and up here in Osage, and I had to get gas, and I live in Charles City, obviously, and so I pulled into the Casey's gas station, and there was a gentleman there with his wife, who I didn't see at first. Anyway, the hood of their car was up, and they were right next to a pump, and so when I pulled in with my pickup, I didn't even recognize or look for faces. I just yelled over, if everything's okay. And the gentleman came out from under the hood, and he was a black guy, and he said, "No, yeah, we're all fine. We don't need any help. We're good." And so I said, "Okay." And then as I'm pumping gas, I don't know. I felt like now they need help, like something's going on. So I asked again and asked if they had a cell phone, if there's anybody to call. And the guy was very timid, and so forth. Eventually, he accepted my help, and he needed a jump. And I couldn't get the jump because I didn't have the cable, so I had to call my son. Son came up and was able to jump him. And as I was talking to him, he apologized because he said he was scared of this encounter. He himself is from, I believe he said it was Virginia, and he was up here working on some rail lines and is living in New Hampton. So I'm sure, your experience in the South, he's probably experienced a lot more racism. The thing that I found most interesting, and it kind of actually broke my heart, to be honest with you, and that was the over politeness on his end. And I couldn't even, honestly, it made me feel uncomfortable because it was like he was elevating me above himself. And all I could think of is, dude, I'm driving a beater truck right now, and you got this sweet ride that just needs a jump. How am I being elevated above you? So as I was driving to that Bible study after Aaron and I helped him out, and he apologized for being scared and so forth. All I could think about was the encounters I have had with black men, friends, dear friends, that there is for many of them, when I first get to know them, there is this almost over politeness, and then as the relationship builds, it kind of gets down to where we talk to each other on equal grounds. So, question here for you is, what I experienced, is that the norm within the black community? And is that just the way that you're raised to treat everybody? Or are parents teaching their children to be overly polite to a person that's white for protection's sake? I'm just curious where it comes from.
Yeah. My mother taught me how to respect all people. Dr. Martin Luther King and I, we share the same birthday. So growing up, my grandparents and my mother, they always taught me his teachings. You know, I've read a few of his books. I know his history. But at the same time, in the black community, there's certain traditions that are passed down. We have a history of slavery. So I believe each generation gets a little bit better when it comes to slavery, but I believe that there are still certain ideas and certain teachings that are passed down. So maybe 50 years ago, a mother and father would tell their black son to only say yes sir, no sir, to be extremely polite, to use the proper tone, to not get aggressive. To white people, 50 years ago it could have been out of fear of getting hung, but in today's time, black people are teaching their children to hold white people to a higher esteem because of what's going on with the police. We have to have a conversation about how to address the police officer when you get pulled over, what kind of body language to have. So it's all driven by fear, and it's the parents' way of being proactive to try to keep their child out of trouble, and also to make sure that black children are seen as not the angry one,
Right.
but the polite, respectful one. Not only so that you don't get in trouble out there, but so that you're not stereotyped as, the negative side
Yeah.
of the way that we can be portrayed. So I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. That was my my intuition. That's kind of what I picked up on. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that that's what it was because, I didn't want to. I don't know. I took it as this was something that was trained in him when he would speak to a stranger that happens to be white.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't want to put that on him or anyone else if that wasn't the case. So no, that's really interesting. I had a gentleman that became a brother to me named Craig Williams, and 6'7" guy, played for the Houston Rockets. Just an incredible man. And God used him really to break my heart and to reshape who I was as a person and how I viewed race and how I understood it. And one of the things that I noticed with him and his relationship with me, and this really helped me, it shaped me a lot, is he was older, for one. He was probably 15 years older than me. And big man. And I was 5'11", and at that time I think I weighed like 156 pounds. So I was a skinny, pole of a guy. And so when he would speak to me as a mentor and as like an older brother, which was, if he would have spoken to me with a voice of fear, to where he would have lifted me up, even if he would have lifted me up to a position of equality with him, I don't think I could have ever respected him the way that I ended up respecting him. Simply because, it was almost like he was saying to me, or God was using him to say to me, is that I have to begin to learn that color and status, class status and so forth, doesn't shape the integrity of the man, and it doesn't shape the authority of the man or the woman. And that Craig was speaking to me in a position of authority really changed a lot of things for me. So here's the thing that I want to ask concerning, because you mentioned policing. What's your take on this? Like, what can be done to where, because it seems obvious, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems obvious that there are a lot of great police officers of multiple different races within the police all over the nation. But yet, there are those that actually are motivated by race or motivated, maybe even it's just motivated by hate and anger or whatever it is. What's your take on that? Like, how can we move forward as a nation to where our policing isn't focused on a person because of their color?
First of all, thank you to all of the police officers out there. I couldn't imagine working, I couldn't imagine having a job where I could die any day, you know. So I definitely respect all police officers. I have a cousin who's a police officer. I admire what you guys do. And I definitely respect the way that the Minneapolis Police Department handled the situation. Not to say that I'm celebrating that man getting fired, but to see him face charges like that is definitely says a lot. I appreciate what Chief Anderson of Charles City did, coming forward and condemning the acts of the police officer in Minneapolis. And I really believe that that's all it is. I mean, some of us don't have the authority or the ability to do something, but we can say something. And some of us have the authority to do something. We have to do something. We have to act. For too long, you know, we saw black people and white people getting killed by police officers. The police officer gets put on administrative leave with pay, and then you never hear about what happened. What were the consequences? So then the black community and the white community feel like there's no justice. You know, so I feel like action is definitely necessary. And for those who can't act, if you stand up and say something, there's a lot of companies right now saying that they stand with the black community in solidarity. That's huge. I've never seen that all at one time the way I'm seeing it right now. So I believe those who can act must act, and those who have that desire or that passion to stand up and say something should say something.
That's good.
It means a lot to the black community. And I don't really like saying black community, but I feel like it's necessary for this conversation. But when the black community feels as though their voice is being heard, and that people of other races are standing with us, then it's a really good feeling.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's really the most that we can do as people, is act when you can act, and when you can't act, at least stand up and say something.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Sunday, I did a little bit of it was kind of a flop of a sermon, I thought, but
it was a great sermon.
We really tried to use the story in Acts of Philip going to Samaria to address this issue. And one of the things at the very end that I said, and unfortunately it didn't get picked up because my mic went out. In-house it got picked up, but online it didn't. And that was, you know, the scripture says to take every thought captive and make it obedient to the word of Christ. And I think a lot of times within the evangelical community, the Christian church, we have this tendency to put a lot of our focus on what we would call moral sins. So my example is, you know, you look at a girl passing by and it's like, oh, take that thought captive. You know, or a girl looks at a guy passing by and she's like, nope, take that thought captive. But at the same time, if you're in a grocery store and you see a black man perusing the shelves, and if your first thought is, what is he up to? Then that's a thought that goes against the word of Christ, right, being that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. That's the thought. That thought has to be taken captive. And I have a feeling that because we put so much emphasis, and there needs to be an emphasis, but we put so much emphasis on physical sins, that how we interact with one another, whether it be race or class or between sexes, that we excuse those thoughts that come up that are against the Word of God, and we don't address them. I spoke to a gentleman through Facebook Messenger. He's a lawyer in the Washington, D.C. area, Virginia area. And one of the things that he had mentioned to me was he was raised high middle class all of his life, went to Harvard, got his law degree, and now works in D.C. And he lives in a gated community, and he drives this nice car. I mean, he's living the high middle class American dream. And yet at the same time, he gets pulled over in his neighborhood because he doesn't look like the person that should be there. And he mentioned, and this blew me away, that he was actually arrested for breaking an entry when he was trying to open his door with his key. And the reason being is a neighbor saw him, and her first assumption was he shouldn't be here. And so I kind of see this even within the evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal, whatever church, as a suspicion when they see somebody that doesn't look like them. How do we begin to address that within the church? That we have to begin to treat one another, treat those the way that you'd want to be treated. How do we begin to actually address that?
I think the first thing that you have to deal with is the heart. You have to ask the Lord to search your heart, and you have to be prepared to deal with the fear. Fear number one is being exposed to what's in your heart. You know, a lot of us have been harboring these feelings that you honestly forget they're there, you know, and they're just your second nature. Everybody has their own stereotypes, but, you know, when it comes down to those feelings, I believe the first step should be to ask God to search your heart and be prepared to deal with what he shows you. And then after, you know, you've allowed the Lord to search your heart, then you need to allow him to deal with your mind. I don't believe that we can do it on our own. We have to allow God into our hearts to show us, and then from there, you got to be transformed in your mind. And I think it's all stemmed from fear.
Yeah.
It all comes from fear. But we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to deal with it. So me personally, you know, I take it to God first. And I ask him to work on my heart, work on my mind, and then show me how to act differently so that I can show, you know, my children a better way.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Absolutely. I think sometimes we think of ourselves, our own personal selves, in very heroic terms, and we don't want to address our own personal sins. Yeah, and so it's a lot easier to point to the sin of somebody else than to address our own sin in our own hearts. And I think sometimes we can be blinded to it, which is one of the most powerful things about the gospel is the gospel reveals, you know, the deep inner parts of our hearts. And so I think sometimes we can just be blind to the fact. And you see this in churches all the time, and even outside of churches, just normal people do this, where it's, you know, well, I'm better than such and such, or, you know, at least I've never done that, right? Yeah. And we don't, it's easier to point the finger at somebody else than it is to actually look deep within our own hearts. And yet, what I'm seeing in this time is that through COVID and now through the situation that we have with the protest, and which in my personal opinion, I mean, I know people disagree with me. I'm for the protest, not much for the riots, but at the same time, it's like, if I truly put myself in that position to where I felt like I was being oppressed and not heard and not having justice, there's a boiling point. There's a breaking point. So I totally get that. But I feel like God is using these situations specifically for the church to get us to begin to quit looking at other people and judging ourselves based on what they do, and began to look at God and judge our own selves based on Him. And then we begin to see, whoa, I've got some ugliness that needs to come out. There's some nastiness that doesn't fit the nature of God that has to come out. So, all right, man, we're going to close here, but if you got anything you just want to say, anything that God has put on your heart, or something that's been in you for a while that you'd like to say to people.
Yeah. If we want to create change, then we must be the change. We all have our own sphere of influence. Some of us have our family, our children, our grandchildren. Some of us are a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company with thousands of people that report to us and admire us. What you do matters, and what you say matters. So if you want to see a change, then we have to be the change. And we have to understand that the change isn't going to come overnight. Some changes are generational. And we're seeing that right here in America. As black and white people, we've come a long way, but still there's a ways to go. So use your influence in a manner that's going to create change down the road. As a father, I have, between my wife and I, 6 children. My message to my family is to, just like Dr. King said, don't judge someone based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And as my neighbor said, I want to teach my children just to respect people, not to look at someone and say, oh, they don't dress like me, or we're different colors, or they live in that neighborhood. No, just respect people and love your neighbor as yourself. And I believe if we can all do that, then we can see the change that we want to see. It'll take some time, but if we want to see the change, we have to be the change. We have to do something, or we have to say something. And as long as we keep God first and allow Him to search our hearts and to, transform us by the renewing of our minds, then we can create the change that we all want to see. Now is the time.
Amen. Amen. All right, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bless you.
Bless you.